custom data layer values feature is the most powerful feature inside of ListenLayer and is available in the Drupal web form listener. This allows you to write rules that push custom values based on those rules into the data layer. You can use these values to then help power and segment your web analytics tracking through a tool like Google Tag Manager. So once this is enabled, it's important to note that you need to define variables. These are your custom variables at the global level. These are available across your listeners to write rules to define values for. In this case, we're going to focus on categorizing our forms as well as identifying form steps inside of Drupal. So let's take a look at our simple rule. When you create a rule, you have an option to create either a simple or a lookup rule. And what this simple rule does is it assigns a name or an identifier to a step in a multi-step form from Drupal. And the reason we need this is because in multi-step forms from Drupal, when you, for example, submit this step to move to a following step, Drupal does not easily identify the step that was submitted. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look for the actual form ID, and we're going to look for a piece of information that was submitted with the form to identify that this is step number one. We know that in this particular form ID, we want email field in the first step. So let's just take a look at what that looks like in our data layer real fast. So we have a form step change, and you can see here's the form ID. And we can see that test was submitted. It's actually easier to see if you look up here in the data layer because this represents the particular instance of what was pushed in. And so we're going to target a form ID and the existence of this email field. So in our rule, we're going to write a condition. In this case, we want the event to be multi-step, and we're just going to look for that email field. And if that email field exists during this step, we know that it's step number one. In this case, I only have one multi-step form, so I'm not going to I add the form ID. But if I did have multiple multi-step forms, I could take the form ID here, and I could ensure that that contains this ID value. For example, I might just target a particular string. It's important to note that Drupal, when they identify these forms, they use the form name and then whatever node the form is existing inside of. And so if you have a single form that's placed in multiple locations across your website, you're not going to want to target the entire form ID because the node can actually change. And so you're going to just want to target a specific string within that. In this case, we're going to keep it simple, and we're going to target email value and form step change. Now, notice that these variables, when I'm looking at targeting a variable in my data layer, it can be very convoluted. We have a lot of variables. And so what I've done here is I've renamed my email value so it's easier to find. And that is done under variable settings. All of the variable information from my data layer is collected here as the listeners find that information. And if I go into field values here, I can find all of the fields in my forms, and I can see I have an email field. And what I really want to know is that there's a value put inside of this individual data layer element. So I've actually renamed this so it's easier to find, and then I saved that. And that's what allows me to easily then, sift through this and just search for email value. And that comes up right away. So when those two things match, what I want to do is I want to identify this as form step number one. And I can also use this dropdown to insert dynamic information from my data layer. In this case, I decided to get the origin path, which is the actual location of the field or of the form or the form step. And In this situation, this might not be something you actually want because you simply want to identify the step, but it illustrates the fact that we can take multiple pieces of information and push them into a single variable, which can be very powerful when we capture that variable inside of GTM and use that in our various web analytics tracking platforms. So let's take a look at another rule. This is a lookup rule. And when I first created this lookup rule, what happens is I name the rule and then I select events and variables that are my conditions. Now, in this case, I want this rule to apply no matter what Drupal activity is occurring, whether a form is submitted, a form is loaded, a validation fails, or my multi-step activity occurs. So I'm actually going to leave this empty. And my condition is only going to target a variable. And if you recall back to when we were looking at our custom data layer variables, I wanted to categorize my forms because maybe I have a lot of different forms on my website. Some of them are demo forms, some of them are content downloads, some of them are support requests. Those are obviously very different things. And so I most likely want to fire maybe one set of conversions for demo forms across my various marketing platforms. But then I want to separate out and maybe I don't even want to fire conversions for my support forms, or maybe I do. For my content forms, I might want to fire conversions, but I might want the value to be lower. And so we're going to use the form ID to categorize that. And in this case, I'm going to use a powerful feature of the lookup table, which allows me to define values for multiple variables at once. And you can actually do that in the simple lookup rules as well. So what that does is it builds a table. Remember my condition of focusing on a form ID, that's over here on the left. And when this is met, I want to push custom values over here into my data layer. I'm sending these values into these variables. And this table is read from top to bottom. And so once a form ID match is found, the values are returned and it'll stop looking through the table. But if it doesn't find a match, it'll go down to the bottom here. And what I've done is I've used my regular expression cheat sheet here, and I've used probably the most popular rule, which is a wildcard, and I've checkmarked use regex. And basically, any form ID that doesn't get caught up in one of these values or matched in one of these values here will waterfall down to the bottom, and these pieces of information will be returned. Notice I'm pushing my form ID in. And that will allow me to then identify, for example, if I send all of this information in an event into Google Analytics, I could occasionally look and see, hey, what are my unknown forms? What are those form IDs? And that's an easy way for me to determine that a particular form might need to be categorized because it wasn't necessarily added. So what I've done here is I've written some rules to target a few forms. And you can see in this case, we might have a form that has an ID containing this value, and that's our demo form. And we might have one containing this value, and that's our support form. And we might have one here that's for content. And I haven't made any changes, so there's nothing to save, but you'll want to make sure you save that and publish. So let's take a look at our website. These rules were already live when my page loaded. And so what you'll notice is that this form, this ID didn't match any of the rules in our lookup table. And so it returned the wildcard values. Down here in my custom values, you can see we have unknown. We have the form name, which in this case, I'm using the form ID to push in there instead of hard coding a value. And then we're changing the user score by 0. So one thing I didn't mention, I have this user score concept over here, and I could actually push different values based on users' activity, and I can run some calculations, and I can actually use a feature here called browser storage to save a user's score in local storage or session storage or cookie if I wanted that to persist. Let's take a look at another form. So this one is that form that we specifically identified as a content form. And what you'll see down here is our form custom values now are content web form 2, and our user score change is 1. So we have 3 variables here. We actually have a 4th variable because of our step change. I can write rules in Google Tag Manager to capture this variable, for example, form category and form name. And I write those rules once. There's just a data layer variable. And let's just show you how you do that here. Let's say I wanted to capture form category. I'm going to copy this property path. And in Tag Manager, I would simply create a variable from my data layer. So it's going to be a data layer variable, and I'm going to paste in this path. And Google Tag Manager then is, I can name this the same thing, or I can, maybe short it, just call it form category. Google Tag Manager, when they read the data layer, will capture this as a variable that you can push into your tags, or you can use in additional rules inside of Google Tag Manager. Customizing the data layer can be extremely powerful. These are just 2 specific examples for Drupal web forms. So we're excited to have you dive in and write your own custom rules and see what's possible.